Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Feminist Economics 101 series. Welcome to every one of you who've joined us and who are spending some aspect of your day with us. We are very pleased to have this series this morning and to share with you some of the insights and work of our guest this morning, Professor Stephanie Seguino. This morning, we really would like to welcome you on behalf of the online committee and also the Young Scholars Committee to this Feminist Economic 101 series, and to also invite you to listen in, to share, to ask your questions. I am Talia Esnard, a senior lecturer and currently head of Department for Behavioral Sciences at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, Trinidad and Tobago. With me this morning, we have Professor Stephanie Seguino, who will join us in a few minutes. But before we do, please allow me to share just a little bit more about our series. As young scholars and persons who are interested in the work of feminist economics, this series allows us to present some of the concepts, questions, methods, insights, lessons learned, and perhaps directions for other scholars in the field. The hope is that this particular series will allow persons to be inspired, to share, to have a dialogue, to learn from others, and certainly to provide visibility to the work of senior scholars and stalwarts in the field like Professor Seguino, and for us to share a space where we could be encouraged and supported by the feminist economist community. If you are interested in more of these series, please, you are free to look at our YouTube videos. They are all online, and they would share with you some of the insights from other senior scholars in the field. Just as a matter of housekeeping, this session is a 1 hour session. This is going to be recorded and subsequently posted on YouTube. We are in Zoom, and we ask that you all keep your mics on mute. And we would certainly invite you to open for questions and perhaps allow for some discussions in the question and answer session. Please be reminded that you are free to put your questions or to place your comments in the chat, and we will also engage those as we enter the question and answer session. Without further delay, please allow me to introduce Professor Seguino. She's a professor of economics at the University of Vermont, USA. She's an associate editor of Feminist Economics, Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, and Review of Keynesian Economics. She's the past president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. She has published extensively in areas of gender inequality, globalization, income distribution, well-being, and microeconomic policy. She has worked as an advisor and as a consultant with many international organizations, including World Bank, United Nations Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and USAID. Her most recent work covers issues of racial inequality and policing in Vermont. Please allow me to welcome Professor Seguino to the session this morning. Welcome, Professor. And thank you for joining us this morning and sharing some of your work and your insights.
Talia, thank you for having me. It's really a delight to be here.
Excellent. So if we perhaps could start with just a bit about your work. What motivated you to be within this space and to do this kind of work in feminist economics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, my life experience was, probably the initial impetus. My family was relatively poor. My parents worked in a factory sewing shoes when I was growing up. And, class inequality I became very aware of class inequality. My father is Southern Italian, whose parenting style he modeled after Mussolini, I would say. And so, had a direct experience of patriarchal life, if you will. But even beyond that, the negative, the restrictions on women's ability to express themselves, to move and so forth, became very apparent to me. And, racial inequality is something I is very prevalent in the United States. And I think you can't live here without observing it. And so all of those influences really shaped my interest in really issues of not only inequality of power differentials and hierarchies.
And so the issue of social stratification seems to be very close to your heart. What are some of the insights that you could share with us in relation to this in your work?
Well, that's a hard question, Talia. I mean, I think that, I think there are several insights. I don't think societies have to be hierarchical. And I think that we have examples of policies that can create greater equality. And we have examples of societies in which there are severe restrictions. And, I guess I would say maybe the biggest, shift for me has been that although I started out as a feminist economist focused really on gender inequality, looking at Asian economies that were very racially homogeneous, as I lived in the Caribbean, sort of living in the United States, racial inequality is fundamental in shaping people's lives. And I I have come to the conclusion that feminist economics, if it only focuses on gender, really misses other forms of stratification. And there are times in which I would say that I've seen gender inequality emphasized when really it's secondary to racial inequality. And I would say that's the case in the United States, for example. And so we really have to have a complex way of understanding the different ways that inequality expresses itself. And that is that there is gender stratification, there's also racial stratification. And I would just say to you who are younger scholars, there are other forms of stratification that I haven't explored around, for example, neurodivergence or religious inequality and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that it's exclusively race and gender, but for me, living here and also living in the countries that I've lived in, it is those two forms of stratification or hierarchy that really dominate people's lives and shape their opportunities and ability to really live good lives and have choices.
It's interesting. So would you advise a young scholar to perhaps engage in intersectional work around the economics of stratification, for example?
Absolutely. And I'll say this about it as well, that, I actually, yes, I want to just say yes again, Talia, that we cannot really fully understand the dynamics of inequality or even gender inequality without understanding the role of race. And, if we take, for example, the United States, racial inequality differs by one's race, right? We have a racial hierarchy that starts with white people, Asians, Latinx folks, and Black people. And if you don't understand that, you really can't understand the dynamics of inequality. I appreciate the shift in feminist economics towards intersectionality, but I think, so for those not familiar, sort of the combined oppression, if you will, of being not only female, but let's say Black. So the different experience of Black women compared to white women. But I think intersectionality, if we focus too much on it, misses the impact on men of color. And I think in particular, the impact of racism on Black men in the United States and brown men in the United States. And so, I think feminist economists have to have a door open to understanding that. And it's complex, right? Because men also men of color are part of a racial hierarchy or gender hierarchy, but we can't forget that their position is that their position is circumscribed by their race and the dangers that they face in living in racially hierarchical societies is substantial and can't be ignored. So I think we need a complex understanding of how racial and gender hierarchies intersect, overlap, or substitute one for the other in various circumstances.
And so we're living in a time where the rationality of the market in an era of globalization seems to displace many of those concerns. What are your thoughts on this?
That globalization displaces concerns about race and gender disparities?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you can't understand inequality without also understanding structural change in economies, right? And so structural change shifts those relationships. And so I'll just say a little bit about that, you know, the impact of globalization, so the ability of corporations to move from one country to another, of money to flow across borders, and goods and services to flow across borders, has empowered certain groups and disempowered other groups. And so in this, you know, you see that capital has benefited because it has greater bargaining power. It can move from one country to the next, but labor cannot. So workers globally, men or women, white people or people of color, have been, as working people, have been disadvantaged by globalization. And you know, people of color when I'm thinking now of the United States, have always suffered in the US economy by being marginalized and at the bottom of the ladder. But now you're seeing what had otherwise been privileged white men who worked in manufacturing disadvantaged by globalization, right? And so, you know, that is either an opportunity for conflict or for division. And of course, what we've seen is that it's been used to divide and conquer. Globalization has really been a mechanism to pit one group against the other. And, you know, whether it is women or, you know, various groups that are seen, or immigrants that are seen as threatening to the otherwise dominant, let's say, white men in the United States who have lost their jobs due to globalization, rather than allying with those groups, with immigrants and women, what we've seen is that politically they have been manipulated, I would say, to oppose people with whom they have common interests. So globalization has really just empowered capital, whether it is wealth capital or productive capital, if you will. And that has been an equalizer in some ways of racial groups and gender groups that had otherwise been privileged as working class people prior to this period of globalization.
And I imagine that structural crises such as what happened in 2008 and perhaps in the pandemic would have sort of altered those dynamics. And I know that you have done some work looking at the crises and how they've impacted inequality. Could you share a little bit on that with us?
Well, you know, every crisis is different, right? And so the Asian financial crisis is different than the 2008 crisis, the so-called Great Recession, and the impact of COVID. And so I would just say that I don't know that I can generalize too much about the impact of crises. They all differ, and that's, you know, that is, I think, the work of economists and anti-racist and feminist economists, is to be able to understand the dynamics that happen specifically in crises. So, for example, in the Great Recession, I think in some ways sort of a classic crisis that disproportionately affected people of color and women, or white women, but or women in also in developing countries who were affected by the crisis in the United States and in other rich countries. COVID was a very different experience, in the sense that it really impacted care workers and really elevated the importance of care work. And that care work, you know, quite frankly, is being done again by women, and also by people of color, whether it is healthcare workers who are in low-wage jobs, or workers of that nature. So I don't know that you can say, you know, every crisis is different, I would say, and that's the fundamental importance of understanding the pathways by which crises disadvantage certain groups and elevate the power of other groups. And there's no one size fits all. It takes really critical thinking to figure out what the dynamics are and what the policy solutions are.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. And I know that some of your work has examined the inequalities in developing countries, perhaps. You've looked at work in Asia, in South Africa, in the Caribbean. Could you just share with us and with the young scholars in the audience a little bit about this kind of comparative work and the insights that you've gained from that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that some of the work I think that's been the most interesting for me is that, and it's why, gender inequality is not the same globally. It's not the same over time, and it's not the same globally. And this is something Nancy Fulbright used to say, that patriarchy is not the same everywhere. It manifests differently depending upon the cultural context and the structure of the economy. And so, South Korea was really my first foray into this, although I spent time in living in Haiti, where I began to see some of the dynamics that emerged in South Korea. And that is the segregation of women into low-wage jobs in the export sector, jobs that are dead end, that pay very little. And in the case of South Korea, was very consistent with a cultural family system in which young girls were sent out to work and sent their earnings back to their family to educate their brothers. Women lost their jobs when they got married, and they were required to provide services to the family. So in that system, right, women, the cultural system in which women are early on segregated into certain kinds of industries that are low wage and are very vulnerable to global crises, global economic crises, meant that moving into the paid work was not the liberating force we might otherwise think it would be. And this is an export economy. And so again, exports of low wage goods are very vulnerable to other countries having low wage workers, and the competition, the ability of firms to move from one country to another should wages rise, makes those workers very vulnerable. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have a very different system that is not manufacturing based on the whole, in which women are primarily constrained to being subsistence farmers and are very important to their families as a result of that. But there are also cultural restrictions on their ownership of land and their access to credit and their ability, therefore, to become economically independent. So the structure of those economies is very different, and the way that women work in those economies as compared to men is very different. In the Caribbean, the Caribbean was so fascinating to me because in many ways you see women that are emancipated in a way that you would not see in South Korea, for example, in which women have a very high labor force participation rate. They have a great responsibility for their families and in providing for their families, as do women in sub-Saharan Africa, but in which Talia and I were just talking about this. Women are, the unemployment rate of women is double the unemployment rate of men. And so one of the things that I, kind of became really clear to me, or, just interesting to me, that I haven't quite figured out how to research, is the fact that in the Caribbean, in countries that are racially homogeneous, such as in the Caribbean, gender seems to take the greater responsibility for reproducing inequality. So the way I say it is that in racially homogeneous societies, it's women who get the bad news of capitalism. But in a country like the United States, in which there's greater racial diversity, I think that onus actually falls primarily to people of color. And so, so in the US, where you have these two strong systems of inequality, of stratification, race seems to trump gender. Whereas in South Korea and in the Caribbean, gender seems to carry the bad news of capitalism because there's no racially marginalized group to dump the bad news of capitalism on. And I've really never figured out how to advance that as a research agenda or to talk differently or, expand the way I think about it. But I think that's fundamentally important for feminist economists to understand, that gender is not always the most important form of inequality, but in the absence of other groups, women disproportionately get the bad news of capitalism. And then how do we rectify that, of course, is the important question.
And so if I just may tease that just a little bit,
Sure.
in both the reference to South Korea and in terms of, I think it was South Africa, you mentioned the importance of culture. How would you position culture as a factor to be examined in relation to gender and race, for example, for young scholars doing work in this area?
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, let me say this. I don't know if I can answer, that entirely, but I think that the major deficit of economics as a discipline is its failure to engage with sociology and psychology. And that has to do with the impact of social norms and stereotypes, which are embedded in culture, right? So in South Africa and Africa more generally, women are much more mobile than they are in Asia. Cultural norms allow women to move around much more, right? There are restrictions on behavior and movement in Asian cultures that don't necessarily exist in some African countries or even Western cultures. Norms, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, women have primary responsibility for providing food for their families in agricultural societies. Not so in other countries. So I would say that the only way that you can get at that is to really understand norms and stereotypes, and that is social psychology and sociology really inform us about that. And it's due to the fact that, that we are social beings. So rational decision making is an infinitesimally small part of the decision making we use every day. We fear social exclusion, and in fact, social exclusion can be threatening to our lives because social connection matters so much. And so how the brain works in terms of responding to social stimuli, exclusion or inclusion, really matters, and how we shape our behaviors. If I could just tell you a very quick story about this. My son was telling me a story the other day about a conflict at work, and he identifies as African American. And there was another woman at work who was white, and they were complaining to their boss, and he in particular was complaining to his boss about certain behavior. And I said, well, what about the woman that you work with? And he said, oh no, she really can't do that because it's just not socially appropriate. And, he hasn't studied feminist economics, but it is something we're deeply aware of, that women are punished for violating social norms. And so rationality is a mere, is a very small part of the way we behave. And I think that feminist economists and anti-racist economists have to really dig in deep to this, to what we understand about social psychology and sociology in understanding human behavior and human choices.
And it's quite interesting that you share that story with your son. And I'm assuming that this was quite recent.
Yeah.
Well, it's very much so. So in light of that, my question for you, what are your thoughts on equitable agendas? In light of what we do and what you do as feminist economists?
Mm. I knew you were going to ask that question. Okay, I'll tell you what I think. I think, first of all, change is very slow. But if those of us who are, my stage of life, if you look back at movies around about the 1950s, for example, in the United States, there has been dramatic change. So change happens, but it happens very slowly. Social norms change very slowly. And so how do we change those norms? Well, I think we have to look at sociological theory and psychological theory about how social norms and stereotypes change. They do change. And one way they change is, for example, the notion, that men ought to be in certain kinds of jobs or dominant positions. That's because we observe that. It's called sex role theory, that it's what we observe which shapes what we think is normal and acceptable. And so the challenge has to be to, for example, to ensure that women and people of color can enter certain types of jobs like STEM jobs or the medical profession, and also have access to positions of authority. And so so I think that's one that I think that we have to, so one of the things I've always focused on is the fact that women's access to employment is fundamental to changing norms around employment, but then also increasing their access to jobs that are non-traditional, if you will, for women. But I think there's another part of this, and that is that, you can try to promote gender and racial equality through various policies, affirmative action, child allowances that support women moving into the paid labor force, family law that requires non-custodial parents to support children and so forth. There's a lot of policies that you can use, but I want to just say this, that I think is really evident in this period of time, that if you were trying to improve women's economic empowerment, if you will, and that of people of color, you can't do it by reducing the economic status of people from the dominant group. And in this case, I'll just say white men. And why is that? Because it results in a backlash. And so I think we have to be sensitive to that fact, and the fact that what we want to improve the position of women of color and women and people of color, but not by lowering the standard of living of people in the dominant group, if you will, especially working class people, but simply by improving women and people of color status at a more rapid rate. And so here's what I think about that. To do that, what we have to do is to ensure, and if I was president, I've thought about this a lot, if I was president, the thing that I would do most is to expand the social safety net so that nobody lives with economic insecurity, that everybody has access to a job that is dignified and pays a living wage with healthcare and good housing and so forth. And part of that has to do with what I've learned about brain functioning and so forth. And that is, I'm going to just explain it to you. I don't know if this is probably crazy for you as economists to hear me saying this, but it's what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and that is that the brain has three components, if you will. The reptilian brain, which is in the back, which controls our automatic processes, our breathing, our heart rate, and so forth, without thinking. We don't think about it, it's automatic. The limbic system, which is, if you will, our emotional brain, and the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the most recent part of our architecture. It is the wise, rational, analytical part of our brain that all of us are using right now. But our limbic system, which is really dominated by what's called the amygdala, is our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. And that mechanism is triggered, if there's fear, for example, then our amygdala tells us to run or to freeze or to fight. And when the amygdala is triggered to a fight, flight, or freeze or fawning mechanism, right? Pleasing as a way to survive, it shuts off the prefrontal cortex. And I fundamentally believe that globalization has really triggered that in us. That is, that we are much more susceptible to emotional thinking, fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms because of the fear of living in economic insecurity, the fear that our jobs will be lost, the fear that we've lost our health care, the fear that we can lose our housing. All of that has made us much more susceptible to political demagogues, right? I think that is what is being appealed to globally today. And the economic insecurity of globalization has really triggered that. So if I were president, if I wanted to solve problems of inequality, quite frankly, the way that I would do this is to begin by providing a social safety net so that we all could live with dignity, that we had economic security, and that we had all of our basic needs met, so that our prefrontal cortex could come online and we could also begin to be wise and analytical about the choices that exist for us. But instead, what I think, what I see amongst white men, for example, is that part of their brain, they've lost their economic status because of loss of good jobs, for example, and the mobility of capital that has threatened their long-term livelihoods. And they've been susceptible to blaming women, blaming immigrants, blaming people of color, blaming, electric cars, and so on and so forth. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but I really think that we need to think more holistically as economists to understand the things that shape our thinking and the ways that we can build solidarity, right? This process of triggering our amygdala and our limbic system as a result of insecurity has made solidarity across groups much more difficult. And quite frankly, the way forward, and I would say, let me add this, that I think especially for feminist economists, we need to do much better job of allying with anti-Black economists, anti-racist economists, with people from the global South and so forth, that we need to see that we are all part of a system of stratification. We are not competing with each other, but it is our solidarity that is going to effect the kinds of changes that lead to equitable lives.
Interesting. And in light of your reference to solidarity, and how this, positions us, what are your views on gender justice? What does that mean to you? And what do you see would be the biggest threat for this to happen?
Well, I think we're living some of that threat, in the efforts to restrict reproductive rights. If women cannot control their reproduction, then they are vulnerable for so many reasons that I don't think I need to explain to this group. But, I think that gender justice means it's such a big question. It means, having equal choices, being able to live the life that you desire to live on the terms that you desire to live it, in terms of being able to express who you are. And women simply live circumscribed lives. I think of myself as a person who's been, a woman who's been relatively privileged as an academic and as a full professor. I live a very equitable life within the university. I'm respected, and I have a voice that I can exercise, and I rarely experience gender discrimination in my work life. But what I've learned is that moving outside of the academic world, I've served as, in my community, on a police commission, on community groups and so forth, that that respect totally dissipates because the norms of the university don't carry through to the rest of society. And I have now directly experienced what gender discrimination looks like and misogyny looks like. And, and so gender justice is not having to experience that, right? Not having to be devalued in various spaces, having your voice count, being able to move around. I mean, we don't think about it as women, perhaps. I mean, those of you from the West, but I think maybe you do, Talia, in Trinidad and Tobago, women's movement is deeply circumscribed. Women don't move around at night alone. There are many spaces that women don't move around in alone. There are many ways that women's lives are circumscribed beyond that. But gender justice is being able to exercise those choices about what you want to do for work, whether or not you want to have children, how you want to live your intimate life. All of that is, you have choices to do that in the same way that men do. And I think the fundamental component of that is economic justice, right? That women absent the ability to provide for yourself in a dignified and meaningful and secure way, you're not going to be on equitable footing with men that are better, that are more advantaged to you in that, because your fallback position, right, your alternative is much weaker and you have less bargaining power as a result. And it leads to norms and stereotypes that end up devaluing women. I think that's the connection that feminist economists need to make, is that our economic status influences norms and stereotypes, and those norms and stereotypes come back and shape our economic opportunities.
Thank you for that. So you've said to us that change is slow. It's happening, but it's slow. But we also know that you've worked with international organizations, right? And you've been very much involved in making some of that structural change and policy change. What are your thoughts and insights about that experience that you could share with young scholars who yearn to be activists and agents of change through these kinds of interventions and experiences?
Well, I think that, it's some of the most interesting work I've done, and I think the most impactful work I've done, right? And that, we can write journal articles that other people read, but if you want to change the world, you have to be in the world. And I would say you have to work with organizations that you don't necessarily agree with. I spent 5 years in Haiti working for USAID, an organization that, quite frankly, represents US corporate interests. And what I learned in working in that organization is none of these organizations are monolithic, and that there is actually a wide variety of views in those organizations, and being part of them, at least for a while, is a good thing. Partly because you learn the thinking that shapes that, but also you have the opportunity to offer an alternative perspective. I will say that I find that United Nations is, a complex organization. It has certain bureaucratic weaknesses, but that its global reach and its basic moral precepts, if you will, are make it an organization that I would more desire to work with than some others. But that you should never shy away from working with an organization that you don't necessarily agree with. I mean, at some point, you will have to leave because your ability to express your viewpoint might be limited by that organization. But that experience helps you understand those organizations and how to shape change and policy thereafter, because they're major players. The IMF and the World Bank are major players globally. And so understanding how they work is important to figuring out policy solutions.
Thank you for that. So I wanted to sort of bring us to a point where we can open up the floor to some of our persons in the room with us. But before we do, I want to ask another question, just one more. In your work, there was a reference to an old adage, an old saying, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more things stay the same. What are your thoughts on that in relation to the work of feminist economists, and what would you like to leave with them thinking against this particular saying?
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah. So that was a paper that I wrote on that was based on the World Values Survey, right? And changing gender attitudes. I don't know if I would use that title anymore, because I'm a little bit more optimistic about change. But change is really slow and can be, and we can backslide as we have been in recent years. Ask me the question again, Talia.
So the question is, I'm just going back to the saying that the more things change, the more things remain the same. And you said it, that it perhaps could be perceived as a pessimistic view. And for persons who are young in the field and who are interested in feminist economist work, what advice would you leave with them in terms of being an advocate for change and being a visionary about change and looking to engage in structural change for their own economies and societies?
Yeah. Well, I think it is, the recognition that even if there is change, it isn't permanent, and there can always that change can always be reversed, as we've seen in recent years.
Pandemic.
And I feel the same way about democracy. Democracy is not something you've achieved and therefore you can go on and ignore those issues and move on to do other things. It's something you fight for every single day, right? I think, ultimately, for me, what has been a dominant feature of my thinking in life is what is it that drives us to want to dominate other people? Under what conditions can we, instead of wanting to dominate, reap the beauty and benefits of being different and thrive from that, rather than trying to repress that and create a hierarchy out of that? That's for me, ultimately, that has been a fundamental question. I think a lack of safety and insecurity and a feeling of insecurity is something that propels us to want to dominate others to maintain security. But I think it's much deeper than that. And I would just say that that anybody that is working towards justice, whether it's, economic justice, whether it's racial or gendered or otherwise, needs to recognize that no change is permanent. And I think also that I would say that we also need to recognize the impact of change on what would appear the enemy or the dominant group, right? And I think in particular of working class men that have been negatively affected by globalization, and that we have to find solidarity with these groups rather than simply privileging our own emphasis on inequality, and that in particular gender. And I guess if I'm going to end with something, I would say that is it, that feminist economists need to look beyond gender, and they need to understand that oppression comes in many forms, and that exclusively looking at gender can lead to divisiveness that makes change take a longer time, and that solidarity across these groups is what is really fundamental for us to move forward.
And thank you for sharing that. So if I may look into our chat and turn over to the comments from our guests this morning. And thank you again for joining us. It is our pleasure to be here with you all. And we have Christine Eglinton, for example, who left a comment and shared this with you, that this interdisciplinary holistic thinking is what we need. And she's also very thankful for you sharing that. We have another comment from Shashki. Considering the possibility of frontier of resources can be stretched beyond a point, and we can possibly hypothesize a future in economic terms wherein we redistribute resources from privileged people. You mentioned that it may lead to a lot of backlash. How do you or we renegotiate a vision of equality, especially from the global south?
Well, I think we have enough resources. I don't think the volume of resources is the issue. It's the distribution of resources. And, in this discussion, I might not have focused enough on class inequality, but that is really, in a capitalist system, class inequality is fundamental. And so I do believe that a redistribution of wealth is possible and is sufficient. I want to also add that the notion that there are too few resources is in part because those of us who've been socialized into capitalism are overconsumed, that we become more focused on consumption and the system in fact socializes us to gain our well-being from consumption, and that can be changed. And so I would just say that but I want to add the last part of this about how we renegotiate a vision of equality, especially for the global south, that I think is a fundamentally important question. And that's a degree of inequality that overlays gender and racial inequality at the national level. And how do we renegotiate that? I think that's a big question, but I think it has to be renegotiated. And I'm just sort of, just thinking here for a moment about mechanisms for doing that. And I think globalization has, the problem of globalization is one that has worsened global inequality between the global north and the global south. And I've, for a long time, been on record as opposing many of the aspects of globalization that have been adopted, and that there are mechanisms for changing that, right? At the World Trade Organization, at the IMF, various economic policies, just as an example, permitting poor countries to impose capital controls, to allow poor countries to reinstitute tariffs to protect their domestic industries. There's a lot of that needs to happen in order to create equity between the so-called global south and the global north. So I don't mean to ignore that. I think that is, for example, that is the structure in which at the national level we're trying to address racial and gender and class inequality. And ultimately, I guess, going back to, I have recommendation for young scholars, if those of us who are concerned with justice more generally, whether it's gender justice or racial justice, have to think at a system level. That microeconomics, in my view, is much less helpful than macroeconomics and system level thinking. And so we have a global economic system that we need to understand deeply in order to understand what's happening at the national level.
Thank you for sharing that. We do have one or two comments, and we have a few doctoral students who perhaps may want to get in touch with you, and certainly the staff of IAFFE would respond to those persons post the interview. And we have a comment from Anthony Kessler, for example, who suggests, why not? And I think it's in line with what you just said with us. Why not envision a future that redistributes wealth? We have more than enough resources to go around. How about the redistribution of unearned wealth? Those that get to enjoy privilege root their wealth in some kind of marginalization of another group, often growing from inherited resources. The backlash of this fact is playing out in our political and social climate. Thank you for sharing that, Anthony. And we have Paulina, who says, you're more optimistic about change than before. What research experiences have led to this transformation? Interesting question. Thank you, Paulina.
So with regard to, Anthony Kessler's question, I couldn't agree more. I quite frankly think that if we don't deal with global wealth inequality, we can't move forward in a lot of other ways. That it is one of inequality of all kinds, including, sort of class inequality and wealth inequality is one of the greatest constraints to achieving improving standards of living globally. I love the notion of unearned wealth because, of course, that's what it is. And I couldn't agree more that if you are a capitalist and you believe in capitalism, then one of your fundamental precepts is that you have to work. You have to work hard, and if you work hard, you earn more. And inherited wealth is unearned, and in fact, the Internal Revenue Service in the United States, that's exactly what they call it. They call it unearned income, income that you generate from your wealth. So I thank the IRS for being honest about that. And in a fair and equal world, there would not be the ability that creates inequality on January 1st every year when children from wealthy families have their trust funds that are open to them. So I think I think that's a fundamental issue to deal with, and we are dealing with that, right? We are trying to deal with that. The proposal of a wealth tax in the United States, a variety of international endeavors to address that are fundamentally important. Now, I would say, truthfully, one of the major macroeconomic challenges we face globally and nationally. With regard to the question about why am I more optimistic about change than before? I don't know. I think it's mostly I'm an optimistic person. I have seen change in my lifetime. I think of the lives of women my mother's age who had very little choice. And here I am, a full professor. My mother had 2 children, had an abusive husband, told me she couldn't leave him because where was she going to go with 2 kids, where divorced women were looked down on and where she couldn't earn enough to support us, and where I've come in my lifetime today. So I think change is possible. And when I look at the younger generation, including younger men, I see changes in norms and stereotypes. I see men being willing to care for their children, men being willing to sacrifice for their partners to advance their careers, men who are becoming self-aware about their own toxic masculinity. So I think that change is possible. I also see the backlash. So, change in either direction is possible. But I do think I think human beings can change. And so I continue to be optimistic about it.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there anyone within the audience who would like to openly ask a question? Please feel free to unmute and to proceed, or you could raise your hands. Do we have anyone? Let's make sure I can see fully. Right, any questions? Yes, we have one question from Mary Barwan. Please proceed.
Hi, Stephanie. So great to see you. And, you've been such an inspiration for my work. It's been really powerful to hear your reflections today. I know we don't have a lot of time, but just in closing, what I'm hearing a lot about these days is more in terms of structural transformation. That's more lines of this like just and green transition, as well as like transitioning to more kind of caring economies. I think I'm grappling a lot with that myself in terms of how do we think about doing this in a just way? Like what would be the kind of macro policies to put in place, especially as we know a lot of the kind of green industries are really stratified, and caring sectors and service sectors haven't traditionally always been very good jobs. I just wonder if like what your thinking is as we're kind of like going forward, especially in this global landscape where countries are so restricted with debt. How are you thinking about these kind of issues of structural change that were upon us?
Good to see you, Mary. Yeah. I've been influenced by a sociologist by the name of Cecilia Ridgway. And one of the things that, she's taught me is that structural change, so the fundamental bifurcation of women and men's economic opportunities has to do with gender job segregation, right? Jobs that are women's jobs and men's jobs and so forth. And one of the things that she argues is that structural change isn't going to necessarily improve women's well-being or the well-being of people of color, for example. And that's because gender and racial norms reinscribe themselves as the economy changes. So new jobs that were not gendered, new jobs that are created that were not gendered are not, we're not born gendered, if you were, become gendered. So they inherit the social and economic norms and structures that existed in a different economic structure. And what that means is that structural change is not the be all and end all. It's not going to solve our problems. So the fact, that we move from types of jobs that require brawn or physical strength, where men dominated, to sort of a technological, computer-driven economies in which physical strength doesn't matter, doesn't mean that those jobs are going to become more equal. What happens is that in every creation of new types of jobs, they inherit the gender inequality and structure of the old jobs, that the good jobs, the good benefits, the opportunities for promotion go to the dominant group, whether it's white people or people of color. So any kind of strategy, any kind of Green New Deal, for example, has to also incorporate specific mechanisms to ensure that those gender and racial barriers are broken down. And I wrote a paper recently on gender and industrial policy. And, some of the things that I, learned in doing that research were so interesting to me. So for example, one thing you learn is that tech companies that are more gender equal have a higher rate of patents, or have developed more patents per capita than those kinds of firms that are male and homogeneous. And that really speaks to the work of an economist by the name of Scott Page, who's done a lot of modeling work and so forth on the impact of diversity on organizations. And what he finds is that organizations that are more diverse perform better than those that are more homogeneous. And he has done these experiments where you have a group that is homogeneous of Mensa level intelligence, right? Super intelligence, versus a diverse group of people that have diverse educations, backgrounds and so forth, and that the diverse group can solve problems more rapidly than the homogeneous group because there are more ideas around the table. And so I think that that's our work, is to, you know, to latch on to that kind of work, to promote the notion that any structural change has to be structural change that is gender equitable, racially equitable, neurodivergent equitable, you name it, right? That the structural change itself is not going to solve the problem, and it will simply find a way to reproduce the problem. And so we have to, I think that's why it's important for feminist economists to look at structural change and have a macro perspective, and not so much of a micro perspective as I see in recent research to understand those changes. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we have one more question here as we come to a close. We have a comment here. Thank you so much for sharing for your presentation. He has a question. How can we ensure equal distribution of resources in a world dominated by global value chains?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. And I wish I had a few minutes to think about this, but I have done a lot of thinking about this issue, and I'm just going to say what's coming off the top of my head about this. That a lot of, you know, what happens with global value change, I'm just going to give you an example of, you know, let's say a company, a garment company like Liz Claiborne, a women's fashion company that sources its products, its garments from developing countries. And, you know, let's say Honduras or El Salvador, for example. So Liz Claiborne has its people, and it calls up its agents in these countries, and a wide diversity of countries, could be China and elsewhere. They have global connections. And so they call up a subcontractor, and they say, you know, we need 10,000 dresses of this style with this fabric delivered by this date for this price. And the subcontractor, which employs mainly women, says, you know, I can't do it. The wage is too low. These women can't live off this wage. The agent from Liz Claiborne hangs up the phone and calls a subcontractor in another country, right? And so that global power of these large corporations really isn't just disenabling for women, it's disabling for small companies in the global South, right? And that's part of the problem of global wealth inequality and global inequality. How do we solve that? Well, I think that I've thought a lot about this, and I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that we have to change that power imbalance. A global living wage, for example, has been proposed. Global labor standards have been proposed. Ultimately, I think it requires workers across borders to be able to organize, but it also, I think it requires some different policies that I haven't figured out yet. But I think we have to rectify that power imbalance. Ultimately, you know, what we have, neoclassical economics aside, we don't have a world of global competition. There is no market competition globally. There are behemoths. There are huge corporations which are dominating and which are benefiting from these global value chains. And the question of how people from workers, especially in poor countries, can benefit from their production is an important one. And I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I think once we can identify the problem, we can begin to develop policy solutions to it. But it's a great question, and quite frankly, one of the most fundamental in terms of issues of inequality. Thank you for that.
Thank you for that. We have just one last question before we close, and this is coming from Maria, who's from Chile. Thank you, Maria, for your question. How are you thinking about the issue of masculinization of wealth? What about research that goes beyond taxing the rich? What are your thoughts, for example, around the role of rich women, the role of gender in how men do deals in Asia, and how that is relevant for people like me in Chile?
You asked me a hard question. I don't
Yes.
know about what you're referring to about how men do deals in Asia, but maybe you can type something in while I'm thinking about this. You know, white women are a problem, right? Wealthy women are a problem. You know, and that's an example of where gender is not the most relevant form of inequality. I don't think that the solution is taxing away the wealth. I think it is ensuring fair wages and benefits to working class people. And how do we get that? So I don't think it's just a question of taxation, although that is certainly a solution. I'm just looking at the chat here. So I don't know the answer to your question. I wish I could talk to you directly about, you know, some of what you're thinking. I mean, yeah, wealth is masculinized. Some women are accessing wealth, but it is masculinized. I don't know how that affects people like you in Chile. I don't know. I'm having a hard time with this question. Maybe you can pop
That's
on
fine.
and
That's
okay.
nice.
All right.
All right, thank you for that. And if I just may ask you, just in closing, if you wanted to share any final thoughts, or is there any burning reflection that you would like to leave with our audience who are here online with us, or those who may view this recording post this event?
I think, you know, thank you for that. That's a great question. I think, you know, in that I'm speaking to young feminist economists, I think, you know, if I had a specific people of advice, it would be to look beyond gender. Gender is not the only form of inequality that matters. And to find ways to reach into groups that are doing work that promotes other kinds of economic justice, whether it's race or other categories, and develop policies. And I guess I would also say, get into the policy world, get outside of the academic work and work with local organizations, with national and international organizations, to both enrich your understanding of how the world works, but also share what you're thinking with these organizations and shape them. I mean, you know, we as feminist economists have fundamentally altered the thinking at the World Bank. Maybe not enough, but we have fundamentally altered that. Gender equality is on the agenda of the World Bank, and although I may be critical of the way they approach it, it is nevertheless part of the DNA of that organization now. And so that is, I think, get beyond the classroom, get beyond writing articles, and engage in the real world.
That's excellent. Wonderful advice in closing. And I just really would like to take the opportunity just to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us this morning, to share your insights, your thoughts on specific issue. And I know that from this session that there are aspects of what you shared today that allows us to think differently, or perhaps explore areas that are still very troubling, still perhaps questions unanswered, and areas that we could think about differently with new directions going forward. So thank you for that, and thank you, members of our audience who have shared your time with us, whether it be this afternoon, this morning, in your evening, whatever time zone that you find us in. Thank you for joining us, and please do look out for more events like these, the Feminist Economics 101. Thank you for joining, and good day, everyone.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.